right, ladies and gents, welcome back to another episode of Blue Grit Radio. This is your host, Eric. And today my guest, you could probably blame him for the reason why I'm doing a podcast, why I'm on podcast. He was the first that, introed me via his podcast, Police Applicant Podcast. So without any further delay, the famous Ken Roybal. Ken, thanks for joining me on the show.
Hey, thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, man. So you've been at the podcast game for a bit.
It's interesting because I started 3 years ago. You know Steve Gould, Things Police Podcast.
Yeah.
I started 3 years ago with him, but I actually started doing podcasting before it had a name back in 2009, 2010 with the Police Background .net, and they didn't even have a name for it. But I was recording interviews with people and stuff.
Yeah, you're recording and then putting on your site. What were you doing back then?
Yeah, I would record it, put the MP3 up on the site, and there would be a player on there. And I can't even remember what we called it, but it was definitely a podcast.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that was essentially just to share out the information, right? Like the content and the resource.
Yeah, some of it was it actually started that way, where it was kind of we were doing candidate stories. And then what it turned into was I started interviewing officers who had been in shootings and things like that, who had been shot, lost their partners, things like that. And it turned into an officer survival type of thing. So it kind of morphed into that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's so cool because there's so much impact that comes from hearing someone's story, like literally hearing it rather than reading it, right? It's another sense. You get so much tone that you can't capture oftentimes without using that format.
Yeah. I think it's a great avenue for people on podcasting just taking off. I'm glad you're in it doing this.
It's nerve-wracking. I'll say I was super nervous coming on the show. It's weird too because most police officers now, you have body cams, so you're very cognizant that you're always being recorded. You could always be recorded. However, the first time you're on something and you're like, man, anyone can listen to this. I hope I don't sound dumb. I hope I don't say anything dumb. There's that increased pressure for whatever reason.
There is. And when I first started podcasting, it was very nerve-wracking. And then there's a little bit of a learning curve. So you get the podcast done, but then you have to edit it. You have to download it, edit it. And editing took me forever when I first started because I was going, I'm going to take out every everything like that. And it just became too much. And I just, it's all natural conversation. I just leave it.
Yeah, that's where I'm at is I think there's so many things that really legit podcasts do. And now it's a balancing act, right? I love being able to do it and sharing the resource, but at the same time, I have to toggle my own expectations and bandwidth to put something out regularly rather than perfecting it, because that could be my nature, is kind of paralyzing and trying to find perfection.
Yeah, when I first started, I put out an episode. I go, this is so exciting. I want to put out episode. But then for some reason I said, I'm going to put out 2 episodes a month. Give myself 2 weeks to relax. And I just started, doing that. And it's made it so much easier for me. Just 2 episodes per month.
Yeah, that's so good. I really do like that organic nature, the feel of just the conversation. And I think people appreciate that, right? They don't want someone that's always polished. And even when it goes to police relations, you could have the typical 10, 20, however decades ago, even existing today, like the public information officer that's just reading the script and the teleprompter. But I've seen, and not just like my own experience, I've gotten the confidence to do it myself by watching others do it really well. But when you have a community meeting or you're just on a really elevated call and someone shows up and they just level with the person, just say what it is. You can show a little bit of your personality. You can show a little bit of the human that, hey, I got to make this arrest. I'm actually not very happy about it either, but this is what it is. It really helps bridge that a bit.
Yeah. I just like, your podcast is good because it's very generic in the sense that you're not going to step on anybody's toes, and you really help people with mental health awareness, physical fitness, and just mentoring candidates. Your podcast is right on. I mean, it's doing well.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it. And how many years you been retired now? Semi-retired, as you stay busy with all this.
23 years this year.
Man, what's it feel like? Does it feel like 23 years?
It doesn't. It goes. People say, "Oh, the career is going to go fast. It'll be gone before you know it." But retirement's the same way. But
Man.
I think the key, Eric, is to keep busy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
That's
you can't.
the trend I hear. Yeah.
Yeah, you've got to, before you retire, you have to have something that you're going to be. You don't have to do it 7 days a week. You can do it 3 times a week, but you have something to do.
Yeah, that's huge. We talked about it just for a second before we started recording, and I was like, man, I think that's so much of it is you stay busy. It's a pseudo job, but it's a fun job, right? And I think that's the goal, right? I think that as much as we can, as much as practical, the first responder job you have should feel fun still. And if you go through weeks and weeks and months and you're like, this isn't fun anymore, then is it really serving you, right? And then the flip being, we talk about cops all the time that don't have a purpose all of a sudden, right? It's almost like the rug was ripped out. They have no substantial hobbies outside of work. They have no real friends outside of work. They don't have anything to do, right? And they don't take another job, even if it's some goofy part-time job or volunteering. And then they don't live very long, right? Because people need purpose to live. They need relationships. So I love that, man. And I think that is one thing that I'm glad we hit it early, because it is so much truly sage wisdom for people listening in that are getting started or very well into their career.
Yeah, it's just, there are some officers that retire and then they go do some part-time gigs somewhere, something like that, or they use the skills that they learned. Some officers are certified in a specialty and they go
Yeah.
use that somewhere.
Mhm.
But at least do something. Don't and I made the mistake when I first retired to go, "Oh, great. I'm gonna sleep in every day for the rest of my life." But that lasted about 3 years, and then I'm like bored. And so I kind of had to reinvent myself. I went back to backgrounds, did that for 12 more years. And then once I retired from that, I parlayed that into my business for backgrounds.
Mhm.
And now I do all kinds of things, but it's related to the expertise that I learned when I was a police officer. So that always works too. Capitalize on what you know.
Yeah. And I love this career for that. I mean, when you hired on, we're going to get into the start of your law enforcement career, but did you hire on thinking, I'm going to be a background officer? I'm going to be a background investigator?
No,
Yeah, it's
because
not like common, right? Like
no.
what kid thinks that, or what
Don't we
teen
get-
or young adult thinks that?
What are you going to do? I'm going to be a background investigator. And when I was hired, background investigators were the elite of the elite. Your background investigator. And so it never even crossed my mind. But I ended up getting into it because a friend was at the division, and I didn't get hired at first in backgrounds. The commander over personnel said no, and backgrounds is going. The commander said no, and he wouldn't sign off on my. So I went to his office, and I sat down with him, and I looked him straight in the face, and I said, "You hurt my feelings when you squashed my promotion." And
Yeah. So
he's
this is after you're an officer, you're trying to get into the background unit.
yeah, I
Okay.
had 17 years on the job.
Man.
But I fell into it by accident. My friend was there. He goes, "Oh, you should come be a background investigator." I go, "Oh, okay, let's give it a try." And then everybody at backgrounds liked me, but the commander wouldn't sign off on me. So it wasn't until I went and told him that, and he said, he goes, "Oh, I hurt your feelings?" And I go, "Yeah." And then he goes, "Okay." And the next month I was on the transfer for backgrounds.
Wow. See, this is very contrary to stereotypes. We think this old school policing LAPD, you're talking about feelings to get you moving and onto a team.
Yeah.
I thought we didn't talk about feelings.
No, I went in there.
He would have thrown you out of the office.
Yeah, you hurt my feelings, man. Well, that was uncool. He really had no reason to keep me out of there. It was just like one of those, I don't think I'm going to have him go in there.
Yeah.
And that was in 1997.
I love that story too, because it really highlights the power of just having a direct conversation, right? Because you could go about it, you could you could MF it, and you would never really know what the thing was, but you can go in and say, hey, and frequently, I mean, that's a tenet that I always encourage people to do is if you didn't get the spot, like find out what you can do better, right? Ask why. If you didn't get the promotion or you didn't score well on the test, you got to go look at the notes. And too often, I talk to friends, peers, whatever, that they go through the test and they're like, well, yeah, I scored middle, so I know what to expect. I got a rep under, and I know how to get better for next time. And I asked, did you go look at the score sheets? Because you're allowed to do that. I mean, it's civil service, and they say no, and I'm like, why would you not? I mean, it's
So,
uncomfortable. I'll tell you, like I've looked at score sheets, and it doesn't feel good to really have people. It's their job, right, to critique the crud out of you. But what better way to learn? And you might not agree with all of it, and you might say, actually, I did. Yeah, they're taking notes on what I said and how I said it, and that is actually how I wanted to present. But at least you own that. At least you know that that's how you come off, or that's how people will pick it up.
yeah. And in this day and age, when there's so much technology and so much information available, there's no reason not to take advantage of everything that's afforded you in bettering yourself to get on the job or to promote.
Yeah, man, absolutely. So to rewind a little bit more, and we kind of started there, but why police? Is that something that you'd always thought about, and how'd you get into it?
Interesting story. So I talk to people all the time. You and I talk to police candidates every day,
Yeah,
and they go, "Yeah, since I was, when I was in the womb, I wanted to be a cop," and all this kind of stuff. And that was not the way it was for me.
mm,
In 1979, a friend of mine had joined the LAPD in 1977, and I thought, "Oh, that's so cool. He's a cop, whatever." And then he goes, "You can be a cop with a high school diploma." And I said, "What?" And I needed a job because I thought I
hmm
was going to be in retail. I thought I was going to be a retail manager, wearing a suit and tie,
yeah,
stuff like that.
not a
And
bad gig.
yeah, so I went ahead and applied. I applied with the LA County Sheriffs, the California Highway Patrol, and LAPD, and passed the written test. Failed the oral interview with the sheriffs. The sergeant who did my oral absolutely could care less that I was there, and I
hmm
felt it, and I bombed that one. Passed the LAPD one and passed the CHP one, but it was only because an opportunity came up. My friend was a cop. Again, if my friend had not been a cop, I would have never have applied for a police department. But it just was opportunity.
Yeah, that familiarity really helps, right? Because one, you didn't know that you were eligible to apply and to test, and then you have a friend, so you have insight like, hey, the water's fine, or the job is actually this way. It's not like the movies, or what have you, right? And
Mhm.
so that's why I love what you've been doing for years. A lot of your coaching, literally your business and your free resources, is a lot of what me and Brian, here at RPD have tried to emulate and model. Is just that, hey, come look at it, come look at us, let's talk about it. Otherwise, people don't know, and I think that's what's really hurting a lot of the police relations. Is there's just a lot of people that don't know cops, and if you don't know them and you don't have a means to meet one and be let in, or them to let you in, then then we're kind of at this divide, and we just don't have understanding.
Yeah, and from my perspective, is that the background investigators are the end result for all the testing, including recruitment. And
Yeah.
recruitment, you have to turn it around where you say to someone, "Hey, you know what? Have you ever thought about being a police officer?" And people will go, "Oh, no, no, not in a million years," because of what they see in the news, in
hmm
social media and stuff. And so that's what makes them think that they don't want to be cops. And so recruitment's job is to turn that around and tell them the realities of what a good profession it is still today.
Yeah, it's such a flip. You talk about the background, and it's such a in tandem team, but historically that's tough too, right? Because rightfully so, backgrounds are the gatekeeper,
Mhm.
and it's really hard when you have people that are not suitable. And I'm not talking about they need a little more experience, or they need to polish up a little bit, or they made some minor mistakes. that they need to grow up and away from. The typical, hey, more time and distance from these things, these
Hmm.
young adult things, and you're a young to medium adult. By the time you're medium to late 20s, then hopefully then you're on the up and up, right? And so we have a lot of those conversations. But I'm talking about the people that you read their personal history questionnaire and their background packet, and you're like, what gave you the sense that you could be a cop? Like, and so it's tough, right? Because we literally have, I mean, you see it nationally, all these ads saying, hey, think about this job. And then you hear all these recruiters saying, we don't care what's in your background,
Yeah.
until you see it sometimes. You're like, no, we do care. The public does care. The lack of integrity, taking advantage of people, deception, all these things, right? So it's such a two sides of the same coin, right?
Yeah. I've talked to candidates and I say like, wow, this is going to be problematic. If you hear me say this is going to be problematic, that's like you're heading down a DQ road. And then I'll say, you need to, it depends on the department, but you need to call the recruiter and find out. And in my mind, I'm going, probably not going to work out for police
Yeah.
work. And they'll call me back and go, yeah, I talked to the recruiter. Good to go. And I'm going, okay, that's, if that's what they want to do,
And do you get follow up, like it actually turns out to be that, or the recruiter got some version of the story and then later they get weeded out, or do
I
you know?
think I think the recruiter's job, and I've never been a recruiter, you can tell me about this, but I think the recruiter's job is to put bodies in seats.
Mm,
And sometimes they want to get those numbers that we recruited X amount. This is just a guess on my part because I know backgrounds well enough to be able to look at a background and know that it's going to be such an issue that they're likely not going to be hired. And when they go talk to a recruiter and the recruiter says, "Yeah, there's no problem with this," and I know the standards, and I even know Washington State's standards to a certain degree, and I'm
mm-hmm.
I'm thinking they're pretty generic across the United States
Yeah.
with subtle differences. But when I hear that someone says this is okay, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure how that works.
Yeah, it's at least from my experience, and we've adapted it and we continue to adapt, but it should be a team effort, right? So the recruiter only knows what the recruiter knows, right? Until
Mhm.
you meet someone, they have this really good demeanor, that maybe they have a compelling story. Maybe you chatted with them for 30 minutes, an hour, you met with them, done the tour, set them up for a ride along, and everything's looking great. Maybe even the guys and gals on the crew love that candidate that rode along because they're professional. But then you look in the packet, or then the investigator does digging, and then as I see it, what's worked well for us is, you bring it. My background investigator brings it back to me and says, "Hey, this is what I found." And then oftentimes, if it doesn't pass the smell test, or if it's not desirable, then it's like, well, that's too bad, right? Like, that's too bad. Like, we'll move on to the next one. You could have 6 out of 10 things great, but when it comes down to it, because of the level of trust we need in the team and out for the public, and the amount of extreme responsibility that's given to cops, like,
Mhm.
there's things that you really got to stick to, and some things are more case by case, based on the times. And marijuana is one, especially in the state of Washington, where different agencies are, I think they're evolving. Some are way more rigid still, and some are very, I guess, the opposite, right? Very liberal with what the use is. So it just depends.
Yeah, and LAPD, the way it worked was LAPD was they had recruiters in LAPD, and but the background investigators worked for the personnel department. Our offices were across the hall from each other,
Mm,
but the recruiters didn't work. We didn't work for them; they didn't work for us. And so the recruiters would come over periodically and go, "Hey, I got this great candidate. Can you tell me what the status is?" And I'd look at them and go, "Yeah, this is a no go on this candidate." And what I found out over the years is that the candidates would tell these recruiters how they walked on water. Oh yeah, I'm just the best candidate
right.
ever. Then when we got their background, you know, the curtain is opened and it's
Hmm.
like this is not the person that was portrayed to you when they were talking to the recruiter. So my suggestion to everybody is if you have something, just lay it out to the recruiter. Don't paint a rosy picture for the recruiter. Tell them what's up. Because it's the worst thing for a recruiter to go, oh, I got this great candidate. It's going to be a great officer, blah, blah, blah. And they go to the background investigator, and the background investigator squashes all hope that this person will ever be hired. Just be honest.
Yeah, for sure. And that's the thing. So I think that's what I had hovering in my brain is you meet someone, they tell you that they got some baggage, and they're like, well, if you want to share, then I can help inform you and guide it along. And so what they share sometimes is not the full story, right? It's not the full extent of it. So a recruiter
Mhm.
being open-minded and probably just trying to be fair to that situation is, hey, based on what you told me, we'd take a look at it, right? And maybe the bosses would talk about it. But when they put it all on paper or it comes out in full form in a full background interview, then maybe it's not as it was initially presented, right? So I think that honesty is huge, right? That you're talking about. And so I know that you commonly give the same advice that most background investigators give, which is to say, let the background investigator say, okay, that's too much, right? Like, let them be the governor. They want to hear it all, so that you're super transparent, you're sharing everything, and then let them be the gauge. Don't err the other way where you say, well, I didn't know if it was a big deal. Like, well, I literally asked, the packet asked you all these questions, and I asked you all these questions. So don't minimize and don't omit, and all these things that we talk about.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it helps to kind of minimize your background with your recruiter, because it's going to come out in your background anyway. So why getting your foot in the door? And there could be something where I've had candidates, they want to just get their foot in the door so they can be in front of someone and explain situations. That's fine too. But at least let your recruiter know. And everyone, like LAPD, um, the recruiters don't have anything to do with backgrounds, and you could tell them all day long, blah, 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 but they're not really going to know because they're not background investigators. But for the most part, at least try to give as much information to the recruiter. And I tell people all the time, call the recruiter, run it by them, and see if that's an issue. And the recruiters will sometimes say that goes against policy, or you need to wait a little bit, or yeah, that's fine. But
Mhm.
I always direct people to the recruitment units.
Yeah. So what's your perspective on that from your, where it's very separate, larger department that makes sense, right? Recruiting is one house, hiring is another house. In my department, we have it very, I wouldn't say hybridized, but we're in the same unit, right? I've done backgrounds, I've done pieces of backgrounds. My recruiter has done backgrounds, but that's not his primary role. What are your thoughts on that? Automatically, I can think of some pros and cons, right? I think the separation is more helpful for bias, because if I'm a recruiter and I meet this gal and she's super sharp and I'm just singing her praises, well, but when she goes over to your office, you should be looking at her objectively, not knowing necessarily uh, how highly I think of her. But at the same time, a department that does share that information, I mean, we might have a real gem here that if we don't act quick and we don't keep her engaged, then she could get snatched up by any department.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is whether someone's going to um going to pass their background.
Mm.
And that's an unknown factor unless you've got someone who's just absolutely has nothing. They got one job, they live with their parents, they got out of high school 3 years ago, and they've got absolutely nothing on their background. You can kind of predict based on the PHS or the PHQ that they're going to be okay. But the other ones where there could be something that needs to be looked into or whatever, that's an unknown area. And I think the having the units separate, which is really good to do, is because nothing's done or nothing's completed until that background is finished, and then you can go back and say, "This is what we found out." Now you decide whether you want to hire them or not. And I think that's a big deal. The objectivity of the background investigators. You use a very good word, being objective. Background investigators are machines. They take information in, they put information out, and write it in a report. That's all they do. Their job is not to go, you know what? I just like you so much. I think you'll be a great cop. That's not the job of the background investigator.
Yeah.
Because if you hurt somebody's feelings because of what you found out, you're not their friend anymore.
Yeah, objective is key, right? Because ultimately it's the boss's decision. It's the hiring decision, right? It's command staff or it's chief. There's a lot of departments that I'd say medium to smaller departments where the chief is going to give the stamp on every single person in front, or a designee, right? Assistant chief or whatnot. So really it is their call. And I think that when you do your adequate job as a background investigator, you just have all the information laid out, right? The file says all the good, bad, the ugly, and it is presented. And then the command might have some more clarifying questions or little things to fill in. But yeah, I love how you put that.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And then I would say for command staff, trust your background investigators. And you and I have talked about this, is that your background investigators have to be good at their jobs. And if they're really good at their jobs, then you can take a file, as the sergeant of the hiring team, take the file to the chief and know this background investigator is solid, and I trust him or her, and here's what they found out. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, I love, again, like objectivity. One thing that popped into my mind is that we all have bias, and we got to make sure that as background investigators, we are being open minded and objective with that, right? So it's the facts, 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 facts. And I think a good way to self check or just keep that objectivity is maybe you sense that, right? Maybe you're sensing, like, man, I just don't like this person. I don't know quite why. I got a weird feeling, but on paper, there's nothing screams out. Why don't you just run the facts by your neighbor, right? The person on the next cubicle over. Say, hey, let
Mhm.
me run something by you. I'm feeling a DQ. Here's what I got. I got these, criminal things. This many years ago. They're this old now. I got this type of employment history. Maybe it's not the worst. Maybe it's not the best. And you kind of explain it with the brass tacks and see if you're off base, right? Because sometimes I've found, at least, I feel like I have it out for someone when I'm screening, but then I read it out loud or I say it out loud, and as I'm saying it and I'm watching the other person's face, like, what are you doing asking me? Yeah, like, that's fair. That's a good DQ. They're not reliable. They're not showing any increased responsibility. You just said their last employment was only X long, and then that makes me feel better, right? And so I think that there are little ways that we can look for it, especially when it is not I'm talking about the non-standard DQs, right? It's more the case by case, look at the whole package of the person.
Yeah, things have changed over the years. When I first started in backgrounds in '97, there were standards. There were 10 standards, California Post standards. It was 1, 2, 3 through 10. Employment, drugs, law enforcement contacts, things like that. And if you fell out of one of those standards, you were out. But then over the years, it's evolved to a whole person assessment. And now what they do, which I think is fine, is that a lot of background units will now, with the whole person assessment, you take their good stuff and you take their
Hmm.
bad stuff and you see which outweighs the other. So you can have little glitches in your background and still be okay, as long as you have bettered yourself over the years and become a better person than the things that you have done. What you have done doesn't define you as a recruit or a candidate.
Yeah, I really like that. Well, that's a lot closer to the approach we have, and I know that a lot of agencies are looking at that. You can have the goody two shoes Boy Scout, Girl Scout that stayed out of trouble, right? And I think it's fair to recognize that that's not everybody, and it doesn't mean that it wasn't you, that doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean you couldn't do this job. So I like the fact that we consider things like time away from that, what you've done, right? People ask me, I think a pretty common one in the recruiting early end is, hey, I got sent to collections, or I filed bankruptcy. Is that a no go? I say, well, it depends. Like, historically, it would be a no go. However, if you filed bankruptcy because you're running a business and it was COVID, and that there's a lot of
Yeah.
context there that's important, right? But what have you done, and what's your financial situation now? Not to say if you're in debt, you can't be a cop. It's just say, hey, candidate A might have taken a lot of very clear uh, responsibility and financial steps in their family over the last few years and really improved their situation, which shows us more accountability and responsibility taking, right? And problem solving. Whereas candidate B says, oh, well, yeah, bankruptcy and foreclosure, like, yeah, I know that's not a deal breaker, but they still have all their credit cards maxed out. They still have two huge car payments. Like, they're not making the decisions that you or I may make to make our situation better. So that is a concern, because you look at that candidate, you're like, well, I don't know how you're going to handle all these mounting responsibilities and stressors just because you get a bigger paycheck. I'm not confident that you will be able to handle improving your obligations to all these financial debts, etc.
Yeah. And I would, and you put it very, very well in that there's sometimes with candidates, there's a point of no return. You can't sew their head back on no matter what you do. And those are just the ones that are, it's just the way, those are the rules. But there are a lot more that have issues that can be fixed over time. Credit's a good example where you had to declare bankruptcy because of 2000 whatever and COVID or whatever it is that came up that tanked the economy. We get it. We're not going to hold it. If you could just fix this up, get into the payment program or pay this collection off, yeah, I think you'll be fine. And it's not that police departments are by nature meant to be the employers of second chances.
Yeah.
It's that they understand that stuff happens, and I don't want anybody to think, because I have tons and tons of candidates that I've worked on that they look bad on paper, but when you sit down and talk to them, it's not as bad as it looks, and they end up getting hired.
Yeah.
But police departments nowadays, they're a lot more understanding about circumstances. Someone has a medical emergency, it costs them $30,000 for a medical bill, they go into collections. Are we going to hold that against them? So those are the types of things where I think that whole person assessment really works out well.
Yeah. So you've worked with hundreds easily. Would you say thousands of applicants between your hired career and then your post career, your semi-retirement?
Yeah, when I was from the time from 97 to when I retired in 2018, I probably completed about 1,400 LAPD backgrounds, and then with retirement closing in on probably 2,000 now.
So with all that, are there any traits, maybe top 3 traits of a person that you feel will define their success level in getting hired, right? Because you see them from maybe they're failing and you're coaching them, and then you see the flip, right? You have all these success stories. Any attributes that stick out to you there?
Personal attributes, the stick-to-itiveness of candidates, the ones who don't quit. And I always tell people, I don't believe police officers are made. I think they're called. And the ones that don't quit, and I have so many success stories of people that have been DQ'd or non-selected, and they come back and they keep fixing the things that the recruiters tell them, or the background investigators say, hey, this is what you need to fix this stuff up. And it's some have taken 5, 10. I had one person 14 years kept trying.
Wow.
And finally they got it where they said, this is what I want to do. I want to do this. And so that stick-to-itiveness, that tenacity to keep moving forward and not taking a DQ or non-select letter and just having the world crumble for them. They get up the next morning. They are on a mission to fix whatever it is, tanked application.
Yeah.
That tenacity is one big deal for me, huge big deal for me.
I think that says a lot, right? If you stuck to a hiring process, I mean, that it feels like when you're doing all these applications, it's a part-time job at least, right? And then you're having to make time or flex time to go to all these hiring appointments, whether it's the oral board, the medical, and then down the line, right? So that you're not even getting paid, right? That's just to get the job. And so 14 years of grinding. I mean, what I love about that, whether it's 14 years or 3 years, is that it shows this commitment level that you're not going to quit just because the going gets tough. You're not gonna pack your bags just because media is having an outroar, or you have really a really volatile arrest where everyone's in your face telling you you're scum, or the shift work is extremely long and you're more fatigued than you really imagine, you're not going to quit, right? Because this job's not easy. And I love it when recruiting actually highlights that. It's not easy.
All right.
The physical grind, right? It's dumping out here in the Seattle area today, and my thoughts go on, and this is going to sound bad, but no, it's like I think about what it's like to step out of your car, you pull out your notepad, the thing is falling apart, and then you're going to flag on traffic or something. You're trying to, I remember holding my notepad kind of upside down to try to get the basic pertinent information that I would forget otherwise. And then you're just going to be flagging on a collision for 40 minutes, soaked to the bone, right? And it's just part of it, right? But then, I think some people try to glorify it in recruiting, but that doesn't do anyone any favors, right? Just paint the job as it is. There's certainly amazing moments that aren't that, but at the same time, you get the bad with the good, and the trauma and all the things I talk about with wellness. Like, I think people need to recognize that so they can be resilient to that.
Yeah, and one of the things that, as far as I try to impress on candidates to not wimp out, because you need to have that mentality, excuse me, before you get on the job. And a really good example of why I say that is you got involved in a situation that, you could have had your eyebrows burnt off and your hair, and you could have lost 10 years because of the situation that you were in. And I hope you shared that on the podcast with your listeners.
Mm-hmm.
About that episode that you were in, but you could have easily folded and ran in the corner and said, "Oh, this is scary," or whatever it is, and you could have quit. If you don't get in that mentality before you get on the job, that I'm not, you think a non-select letter is going to crush your world? Wait until you become an Eric Tung and you get in this situation where something blows up and you
Yeah.
cannot quit. That's the mentality that I want candidates to have, that tenacity before they get on the job, because when the bullets start flying and you get shot, maybe you're not going to lay on the floor and die. So if
Mm-hmm.
you don't have that stick to that motivation to survive, just the hiring process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And real quick, a couple thoughts come up where I'm not positive I've spelled that whole story out on my podcast. I've definitely been on a few to talk about that, where I was working K9 and it was an officer-involved shooting where the suspect we were looking for popped out, and it was a firefight to dramatize a little bit. But no, there were several officers involved in the shooting, and I don't want at all, or I want to clarify that for anyone that's in that deadly situation, if you walk away from the job afterwards, then good on you, right? And I think it's a personal gut check, maybe it's a family gut check, or PTS being what it is, like no judgment. You've done your service, but I do appreciate what you said, Ken, right? When you're in it, you can't not be in it. And I remember, and I want to share is that, when the gunfire started, I was in the gunfight, and then when the explosion happened, there was a part of me that I don't love it, but it happened, so I'll share. But where I was just like, this is over, and that's not what you learn in academy, right? It's never over, and so that I share that to say a couple things. One, you got to stay in the fight. Two, even if you recognize or you have that thought, it's okay. Get back in the fight, right? Because I was, this flame passed over me. It felt like seconds, but to the outside perimeter cops, you're like, oh, it's like a flash of like a half second, which is how your memory and perception works. But it was just so hot, and I was just like, man, I guess this is it. Of getting burnt to a crisp. But as it passed over, and I remember being super disoriented, but I remember also kind of coming to my senses and being like, what is going on? Oh, is the fight still going? And so I share that to say, hey, we don't know how our bodies will respond to things. We can definitely train a better outcome. I think stress inoculation training, I think active training your brain, but also adequate range and tactics is very much going to help that. However, I don't disparage the cops that, you see a video and the gunfire starts and they look shocked for a second. Maybe they even retreat a few steps, but then they go back in, right? Because Like we can't drag them through the mud, but no, you still have a job to do, and it is to survive and protect your life and that of others. So, but yeah, what a crazy experience, and I feel fortunate that I've been able to stay in the job. I worked a lot of years in patrol after that, and I'm not so much in the mix now. But I think everyone's different. But I do really focus on the things that you can control, like wellness, to build resilience. Relationships and health. I think those were huge contributing factors to me being able to continue to navigate this career. But am I left unscathed? Like, absolutely not, right? There's physical scars, and I'm sure there's mental scars or some versions of those that carried on through my career. Especially when your adrenaline spikes for whatever reason. Like, yeah, it's because of a lot of that.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to get all dramatic about applying, but that's just the kind of mentality you have to have getting into the job, because if you don't have that in your mind, you're not going to survive, certain aspects of the job because you wimped out.
Yeah.
And that's not dramatic. You can't wimp out. Excuse me. You can't wimp out on the job.
hmm
So that is one trait that I really, really enjoy. Another one, Eric, is self-awareness. If somebody comes to you, a background investigator, a recruiter, and goes, "Hey, you got to fix this stuff up," don't make excuses. Just be aware that you actually have done something that could jeopardize your ability to be a police officer, and fix it.
hmm
But
Ownership, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And the
Everyone
other
wants to
thing,
hear that.
yeah, and the third one for me is honesty. And it's not just, you always hear "you lie, you die," which is true. In backgrounds, you lie, you die. But when I talk about honesty, I'm not just talking about being honest on the PHS or the PHQ, but I'm talking about honesty in owning up to what you've done. If
hmm
you've done something, don't try and sugarcoat it. Don't put it off on other people that, this is why it happened because so and so did it. Say, this is what happened.
Yep.
And that's it.
Yep.
I appreciate people, because you and I have spoken about this before. It's not what you've done that gets you DQ'd. It's that you lied about it or that you minimized it. Just say, "Hey, when I was 17, I was in a car, we threw water balloons at people and I got, the police stopped us." Okay, fine. That's what happened,
hmm
and I appreciate that when people just tell me stuff.
Yeah. I love that how you framed it, right? It's not just honesty to be honest, but I think about the prior prong, right? Self-awareness. It takes being honest with yourself, right? It takes introspection. It takes checking the ego, and that simple example, right? I was being a dummy when I was 17, and you don't sugarcoat it. You don't downplay it. You didn't say, "Oh, we chucked a couple balloons. No one was hurt," whatever. No, you say what happened. Like you threw them at cars. You hit one person or whatever, right? You were with these people. It was this many years ago, and as you get into the discussion of it with your background, then it's less about why it wasn't significant, but what you learned from it and what you did to distance yourself from that, right? I realized I was about to go into the military, and I signed up for the military because I knew I needed to grow up, and my family told me I needed
Yeah.
to grow up. Or I went to college and I was like, hey, this is a chance for me to have a clean slate. I turned my high school, just messing around and being a jokester into, hey, I'm gonna pay a lot of money and take on a lot of debt to learn something of value, and look at this GPA I was able to produce. Not to say, hey, smoke and mirrors, don't look at this, but to say, no, I learned a lot. Here's what I learned, and here's my track record as I stopped doing that stuff. And people appreciate that, right? Because again, you're not looking to hire a perfect angel. Many cops would actually argue that's not ideal when you're interacting with the people we interact with. One, because you don't have any exposure, and two, you might not have very much empathy for people that mess up or have their mistakes on their bad day. So yeah, it's so much of those things. I love how you highlighted those three things: tenacity, self-awareness, and honesty.
And isn't it a great story and one thing that I do that I don't know if a lot of background investigators do it, is if I see a background and somebody's got some issues in there when they were young, and I'll look at the years and I'll say, there's like 3, 4 years where something's going on, and I'll ask the candidate, so what happened in those years? And
Hmm.
they'll always tell me something like, my mom died, my dad got sick, my parents
Hmm.
got divorced. And then all of a sudden, all this stuff is happening during those years and they're acting out. Then they get out of high school and they get a 4-year degree and they get a good job and they get married and they buy a house and they have kids and blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden it changes around. Are we going to, as background investigators and recruiters, go, yeah, that's awesome, but yeah, well, these 4 years when you were 14 to 17 or whatever, yeah, we're going to have to hold that against you. Is that how it works for me? I don't think so, because I like to find out where you came from, what you did, and the people that say, yeah, I didn't want to live like that. Those are awesome. They make awesome cops.
Yeah.
And that's what I love.
Yeah, that's why I love the context and the whole person. To go back to that is we all have these terrible circumstances, but if that's our worst and then we grow out of it, or with the background, you have this actual track record where you look at what happened in someone's life and have they grown out of it. And because again, in this job you're going to have some bad days. And so if we can predict the future behavior based a little bit on that and the character traits that they've built, resiliency, healthier practice, healthier lifestyle, right? Maybe it's a background of someone that got popped for DUI 10 years ago and now they don't drink anymore. And their life is super different, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they're not young and dumb. They have 3 kids that depend on them. They show this employment history and they reflect on life a lot differently. Then okay, that's very different, right? I mean, we can all take a moment, and I know that some people grew up more traditionally and maybe more rigidly, and sometimes from my experience it's harder for them to empathize with others that didn't grow up that way. But think about it in the context of, hey, we all know really good cops that had really bad days or really hard life circumstances, and maybe they fell into the bottle, or maybe they split up with their ex. Does that mean they couldn't be good cops? No, we all know the ones that were able to climb out of that, through practice or through whatever they're doing. And so look at it like that. Are they bad people? And this is not to excuse the ones that aren't. I'm saying, yeah, no, we all know ones that are. They've just made some. I'm sorry. You all know people that are good people. They've just made some mistakes and distanced themselves, right? Or had the reformation in their lives.
Yeah, and for candidates that a lot of time I've had candidates where they get a hold of me for a consultation and I'll send them the information, fill out this PIQ, I need this PHS, and then I don't hear, all of a sudden they drop off the face of the earth. So I contact them. And this has happened more than one time where I say, hey, so where you been? We're supposed to do a consultation. I'm supposed to get this paperwork. I've had people that say, you know what, I started filling out the application and there's so much stuff in there. I just felt like crap and I didn't
Mm.
want to, and I just felt like I didn't want to go through with this. It's going to be too hard for me. No one's going to want to hire me. Don't feel that way, because there are some variables with police departments, but overall there's a good opportunity that if you have a decent background, that who you are today matters so much more than who you were 5 years ago. So give the background investigators in the recruitment units a chance to look at you and see where they might shock you. If you feel bad about yourself, doesn't mean that your background investigator is gonna ream you for it. You need to give them a chance.
Yeah, that's fair too. Oftentimes we're our worst critics, right?
Yeah.
So someone from the outside might say, "Hey, like, no, I love what you got on paper right now. I love what you got going on in your life." At the same time, recognize every department could be a little different, every culture, every command staff, and background culture too. And so, if you don't have all these very clear disqualifiers, and hopefully the backgrounders are providing some context, it's one of my pet peeves, and I'll ask for a couple of years in a minute, Ken. But when they give no guidance, right? Because if it's about coaching and mentorship, it's nice if you're able to give someone that's almost there that encouragement that, hey, you're almost there. I bet if you keep on the track you're at, in a
Mm-hmm.
year, I bet you'd get hired in my agency or a similar agency. At the same time, when our hiring picked up and we had very few vacancies, I appreciate the fact that I'm allowed to say, hey, it's really competitive right now. a year ago, we probably would have moved you on to the next step. Right now, we're not because of what the bosses are looking for. But keep it up because you'll get hired at this agency or that agency, or these cities are hiring really aggressively because they're in the state that we were in about a year and a half ago. And I know they have this many vacancies. And so that's helpful, right? Like rather than turn someone away from the job that's very well suited, they're just not cutting it right here, right now. Let's provide that feedback. So yeah, I mean, with that, are there any real pet peeves for you when that you see other background either units or investigators do, especially because you do so much consulting?
Yeah, well, and we've spoken about this too.
Mm-hmm.
There are a few things with background investigators, and you know what? I have to tell you, not everybody's called to be a background investigator. There- There's some people, just because you see somebody who says that they're a background investigator doesn't mean they're good at their job. Some people just should not be in there, and that's just all there is to it. There are lazy background investigators. Background investigators, you look at a PHS, PAQ, and they go, nah, you know what? This is a non-select. And I would say, have you looked at the background? Did you look at it? No, they got DQ'd by this agency or that agency, so I DQ'd them too, or non-select. That's lazy. That's just being lazy. You're passing up potentially really good um, candidates because of that. Another thing are the background investigators that they just love a DQ. They just live for a DQ. It's like red meat to them or something like that. And I'm like, that does not make you a good. I've told background investigators that doesn't make you a good background investigator. It just
Sure.
means you nitpicked and found something to DQ someone. It was a weak. That's a weak DQ. And I could go on and on about the background of some background investigators think that they're when they get the candidates in for just the meet and greet. Hey, so I'm your background investigator. Let's go over your background. That they think they're interviewing a homicide suspect.
Mm-hmm.
Like the lamp is swinging across the ceiling, and you're just like, so like you don't have to be all hardcore about it. You're in charge. There's so many things about some background investigators that just bother me.
Yeah, I hate the last one because again, it goes completely contrary to what the recruiting has done so hard to do, and hopefully the rest of the PD, right? When they're in a ride along or the command staff, which I do still hear about some command staffs that are pretty, grilling, and there's a time and place, right? And I think that the context is important, right? It's one thing if you're asking them some critical questions about their background. It's another thing if you're making them feel like a criminal, which
Right.
is not helpful, right? And if you want to entice them to be on your team rather than someone else's, and then bring them into the fold. Like I think that should happen earlier. I don't think it should happen after they're hired only. I don't think it should happen once they prove themselves after probation. I was like, no, help them be successful. So I love that point, right? Because what's the goal? Is the goal to intimidate them and scare them into an admission, or is it to get to learn every little thing about them as best you can? And truly, I've seen some of the best background investigators, not just in my region, but conceptually, is that they it's the same as investigations, right? There's a tactic for it, there's a time and place, but
Right.
overall, you hear some of the best investigators, whether it's homicides or backgrounds, recognizing that you catch more flies with honey, right? You get to know the person, you make them comfortable, you build rapport, and even though in criminal investigations, even though they might be a total scumbag, some of the best detectives I've learned about or met are the ones that really relax it, right? They let their guard down. And so, in essence, even if you're kind of a skeptic, you're like, no, I'm a background investigator, and my job is to find out all the dirt. Try it, right? Maybe make them comfortable, let their guard down. It's still the same outcome, right? And they just feel better about it if there is no dirt. Then they feel like you're a nice guy rather than the opposite. Because I had a hiring experience when I was entry level at a department in the region where I did feel like a criminal. I felt like I was being interrogated from the background. Same person did the polygraph. I just felt like this big, and I'm holding my fingers apart like about a centimeter. but that's after I passed another one, right? I passed another background in a polygraph, and then I go into this department, and I felt like scum, and it really set the stage for me not wanting to work there. And so when when Kent PD had the offer just about done, I felt very comfortable to pass on that other agency, because I was like, this is not. I just don't really jive with this, right? It's not the kind of team I want to be on. Literally, no one's really smiling or talking to each other in the hallways, which was another clue. Command staff was another clue, right? When they're giving me an offer and kind of rolling their eyes and saying, "Well, do you want it or not?"
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
so yeah, man.
And I think that another thing to consider as a background investigator is that if somebody has a background that some things have happened and they are not proud of it or it's embarrassing, is to realize that police candidates are required to tell you the most embarrassing things in their lives. Um, and it's tough. And they know that they're going to turn in their application, and it's going to be someone's going to see it, and then it's going to go around here and they're going to see it. And then when they get in front of their background investigators don't need to make people feel more like crap than they already do, because of what they have to talk about again
Hmm.
in a meet and greet interview, because they had to put it on the application. Now I'm going to want to talk to you about it. I don't need you to walk out of the meet and greet interview with you thinking how crappy you are.
Yeah.
There's a time and place for for you know um, um, being a little bit more hardcore, finding out the information that you need to find out. As a background investigator, I don't need to get excited about stuff. I know what I'm doing, and I'm gonna talk to the candidates about that. But my job isn't to make them go out and go stand on the freeway and let cars hit them because they feel so bad because of the way I treated them.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't see there's a place for that. But background investigators just need to be confident in their own abilities to do the job and to get the information that they need. The candidate, yeah, with the thing with the rolling the eyes, a candidate tells you something on their PHS, and you don't need to be sitting there going, "Oh wow, man! I mean, what were you thinking?"
Yeah.
That.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of an interview I just did with a area cop that talked about how when he goes to a situation, he's like, when you go to a 911 call, people know that things are not going great. They don't really need a cop to tell them how not great it's going. And I'm like, man, what a simple way to say that, right? I heard empathy, but for him, it's just like, I mean, do you really need to kick someone when they're down? Which
Right.
is unfortunate. You see that, right? Like, our role is not to be judge, jury, and I think that when people lean into that executioner hat, like you're talking about, like, oh, I'm the DQ person. Yeah, there's a time and place, and when someone is scummy, it does feel kind of good. I'm not gonna lie, but no, yeah, you're one piece of the hiring puzzle. You have a role. It's objective, and so just stay true to that.
Yeah, and and another part of background investigations is the thrill of the hunt, right? Ferreting out people that, oh, you tried to put a fast one on me, but I found
Hmm.
out. That's
Yeah.
the thrill of the hunt, and that's why they're called background investigators,
Yeah.
because they're and another key trait of a good background investigator is not only to find out things that a person is trying to hide that could lead to keeping someone out of the department that shouldn't be there, but it's also to clear things up, to clear candidates. If something happens, it's the background investigator's job to find out if that's the case, and to find information that could clear them to get
Hmm.
on the job, not just to
Yep.
keep people off the job.
Yeah. An example pops into mind, and I'll keep it super vague, but I was reaching out to another department that had a DQ on a candidate I was looking at, and the investigator cited some verbiage and some old stuff from the PHQ in the teenage years, and then saw an investigation at work with the label of harassment, and said, "Hey, so I figure it's with regard to sexual harassment and such." Never looked at the investigation, the IA type of paperwork, and so I came to find out it was nothing to do with that. It was called harassment because someone said, "Hey, this person's bothering me," but he didn't even have direct communication. It was unfounded, It wasn't substantiated. There's no policy violations at his workplace. And so really it was a lack of investigation. It was connecting. It was not, it was finding the most loose connection to two things just purely off of inference. So, and if that was the big smoking gun, then it was not one, right? So at least be able to give that person some clarity and move them along, right? Don't know, don't know if it's going to be a good hire. We're not there yet, but at least it's one example where you can look at that thing and that DQ is not substantiated.
No, and I tell candidates, the best thing you can do is to front load your PHS and if there's something in there that you need to get out there for the background investigator to know, try and get that information out, whether it's a Word document that's attached to a paper PHS, or if it's an online application, get additional paperwork into personnel or whoever it is that's accepting the applications. Please attach this to my application, because when you have one chance to make a first impression, and a lot of times background investigators would go, "Oh, look at this PHS. Oh, poo-poo, this is what," and the perfect example of what you're saying is somebody looks at it and they go, "Oh, this background investigator, blah, blah, blah," when in fact, that's not the true story. So sometimes you need to get the information out ahead of time. And so the background investigator looks at it and go, "Oh, what's this? Oh, what's this other paper? Oh, okay, well, let me talk to the background investigator." And if you could just get in front of a background investigator, let them know, plead your case and let them know this is what happened. So many times the BI will go, "Ah, dude, you know what? I was wrong in my first assessment. And then now that with this additional information," but a lot of times the applications don't give you that opportunity to do that.
Yeah. That's good, man. Well, I really want to be mindful, and I appreciate your time. You've given some really good tips to applicants, and truly some really good tips to backgrounders, which I think you provide a lot of that in your podcast, but there may not be that many background investigators actively listening, right, to the Police Applicant Podcast, but maybe they should. So thank you so much for everything, Ken, your intro into me even doing this. Where can the listeners find more about you and find what you're doing?
There's two places. One is policebackground.net. That's where you find out about the consultation services. The other thing is the Police Applicant Podcast. Just go to Google, type in the Police Applicant Podcast. We have we're on Apple, Spotify. Spotify is our preferred partner, and also we have a YouTube channel which has a little different flavor to it as far as content. But that's how they can find me.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Ken, and to the listeners. Be sure to share this out, subscribe, not just here, but to Ken's work, for everyone that is getting into law enforcement or in law enforcement. Certainly a resource. And even for people you don't know, right? Share it out, because if someone's on the fence and they start listening to Ken, that might help them a lot out, right? They might hear examples and success stories to recognize that they are exactly what police agencies are looking for and what it takes to be successful.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Ken.
Absolutely.